This is the Open University.
Hello students, some statistics for you. It's 2 degrees in the flat according to my wall thermometer, which I think must be wrong. It's not that cold. It's a leaden overcast day outside. Earlier on we had 50 km/h winds, but they've blown themselves out as the remnants of the storm have passed. And we're 3 weeks into this recording process for Smudger, the 2022 album from Momus, and I've done 14 tracks in 3 weeks. So somebody very kindly said on Twitter, I think, you get the impression the Momus could probably do 10 albums a year and they'd all be good. It's very kind, but physically I don't think I'd be able to support that kind of punishment, because my eyes get very bleary and my ears get very waxy and the tinnitus plays up, and my blood pressure goes up because I'm not getting enough exercise. There isn't much to call me out into the world at the moment out in the winter Welt of the Berlin winter, which I skipped last year. So I think it's hit me with particular force this year. I'm a second-class citizen again because although I've had 2 vaccinations, I don't have a booster yet, so I'm not allowed into cafes and things like that. So also there's very little to draw me out, which is good. When you make an album in January, it's great that there's no distractions, and the sensual delights of summer are not there to lure you out. But also there's a kind of melancholy dead feeling because nature is dead. I used to make albums, like Tender Pervert, for instance, was made in the spring, and you can see the blossom on the cover, and there's a sense of the thrust of new life coming and an excitement about, sex and sensuality and life itself, the life force, eros, in a record made then. Then, more recently, I've made albums in Japan in the rainy season because there's no reason to go out in the rain. And, from mid-June to July-ish, you get heavy, heavy rain. And then the cicadas come out. Suddenly there's this beautiful post-rainy autumn. So each kind of album you make has a different relationship to nature, I suppose. Your own human nature and the world out there. There are all these structuring sort of contradictions. It's also adventures in culture. You're kind of turning then into now, updating things, and you're turning theirs into mine, appropriating things. And you're speaking to the present about how you're feeling in the present, but you're also speaking to the future. And there's a line in one of the new songs, I'm going to haunt the fuck out of history, make sure they're discussing me. So, hello, John Robertson in 2035 doing the book about this album. I'm probably dead, but I'm still speaking to you. And that's the amazing thing about culture, is that it's a kind of way to persist even after your physical disappearance. The first song of the new batch, which is probably the last batch, I think the record's finished, was called Friends. And Friends, it goes, like a lot of these songs, it goes back about 100 years. And also 10 years in my personal story, because in 2011 I put out a video of a song called Put a Bit of Treacle on My Pudding, Marianne, which was an old music hall song by Harry Champion, famous for Any Old Iron and other songs.
On my wedding day, we didn't have a big display. Greens and potatoes and a little bit of beef, and my wife made a boiled suet pudding for a treat. I had a little bit of pudding for my supper. I fancied something light. Said I know, mate, how I'm gonna celebrate on this important night. Put a bit of treacle on my pudding, Marianne, 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 Marianne. Cover it, smother it, don't you stop till you can't see the pudding for the treacle on the top. I like a pudding when a pudding is a good one, and I don't want cake or jam. So put a bit of treacle on, treacle on, treacle on, treacle on my pudding, Marianne.
And I put Fad Gadget in the video, covered in oil and feathers. And treacle, it was a typical piece of kind of double entendre, innuendo by Harry Champion. He does these very rhythmic verses, Harry Champion. Treacle on the pudding becomes a very sexual metaphor. So anyway, I did this cover of Put a Bit of Treacle on My Pudding, Marianne. Then I came across this, I was listening to old music hall songs, and I found this song called Don't Do It Again, Matilda, also by Harry Champion.
don't do it again, Matilda, don't do it again. Your beautiful teeth, they are most unkind. Never been me before, but they've been me behind. Wow, wow, they're biting me now and I cannot locate the vein. Pull them out of his house, put them into your mouth and don't do it again.
It's from 1910. And the verses kind of sketch out these funny real-life situations, and the choruses are, again, innuendo charged, don't do it again, you know, I've seen up your skirt once already, kind of thing. So it's very vulgar, in a good way. And I just kind of, I took that chorus line, don't do it again, and made my own sort of song around it, which recounts various terrible types of behaviour that your friends might do to you. Not necessarily things that have happened, except insofar as I did once live with a junkie in the 80s in Chelsea in London, who kind of kept locking herself in the bathroom or stealing our television set to score her next hit of heroin. There's a bit of scary monsters in Friends, and so I'm sort of updating the social problems with, you know, things happening around the back of a little or crack users out on the street. Something I was living right next door to when I was in Athens last year in Metaxorgeo, seeing a lot of amazing, you know, people giving head in broad daylight and people throwing bloody syringes in front of me as I passed by, and people mostly just clustering in doorways looking very sad, waiting for the dealers to come on their bicycles and sell them more crack. There's also kind of modern talk of boundary issues and taking back control, and these sort of buzz phrases which I like to put in. And as I said last time, there isn't necessarily any personal perspective on these topics. It's really just, you know, these are things which are in the air, and when you're writing a song, you often just reach out into what's in the air. You often really don't know why you're mentioning things, just that they've been somehow current, they've been on your radar. So that song, I suppose it was a way to get back after the rather lugubrious songs like Supervillain, to storytelling and the music hall tradition. I suppose the cabaret tradition for me, it's fun, it's pithy and satirical. The next one was Tottenham, and I wasn't very happy with this one when I made it. It started with a piece of music in the background of a film about a town called Foix, Foix in France, which is in the Occitanie region in southwest France. And it just was showing, it was called the shabbiest town in France.
Le superbe château de Foix est l'attraction majeure du département. 100 000 visites par an. Foix, habité par les Fuxéens, recèle bien d'autres merveilles.
And they had this medieval music and they showed the castle, which is the main tourist attraction. I suppose it just reminded me that I really like this honking medieval dance music. It's sort of music you'd imagine people dancing to in Bruegel paintings, with sack butts and crumhorns and things like that. And of course I went through a phase of working with the Dufay Collective, making records for Kihimi Kari, and stuff that appeared on my Folktronic album was very much influenced by Renaissance and medieval music. The earliest known songs really in the Anglo-Saxon world had come out of this tradition, and so I was lucky enough to have the budget working on Kihimi Kari's Journey to the Centre of Me EP to work with real regals and crumhorns and viols and sackbuts and things like that, but the musicians who were playing in the Shakespeare Globe Theatre in London. Because it's a medieval theme, you're kind of thinking of François Villon, or you're thinking of the updates of Villon by Brecht and Brel. Brel, when he's writing Les Flamands, they dance because they're 20 years old, and then they, you know, sort of condemning the kind of traditional society of the normal stages of, you know, birth, death, marriage, or whatever, not in that order. In my version, it's a song about the death of sex, and it was something that was very much in the air. I think I read a Guardian interview with a film director who said you can't really make films about sex anymore because it's such a problematical issue. Gender politics, and also a kind of a sense of withdrawal from sex for other reasons. The pandemic, of course, has changed our sexual behaviour, much less kind of random dating out there. Also, far fewer sex scenes in films, fewer songs which are, you know, sexy in the way that someone like Gainsbourg used to be. But this film director was saying even films he'd made like in 2010, he couldn't make in 2022, just because the mores have changed. I'm someone who's really, you know, raised in the so-called permissive society of the 1960s, and that whole radical school of psychoanalysis that came up in the 60s, when psychoanalysis, which originally Freud had intended just to make it easier for people who were ill, in some way to love and to work, I think he put it, gets flipped over by people like Thomas Satz and David Cooper and R.D. Langer in the 60s into saying that actually normal society is what's sick, and things like the family, institutions like the family, and particularly the state, are kind of just manifestations of psychopathology. I really bought that. That was an extension, really, the so-called anti-psychiatry movement, an extension of Wilhelm Reich's thinking. I mean, someone like Wilhelm Reich would be cancelled instantly today with his orgone accumulators and all the rest of it. But it's been very influential on me, and so I'm sad to see sex, retreating, and the demographics also changing because of that. That we have Western populations which are declining now partly because of all this. Also because of good things like education levels going up and more women being in the workforce and all the rest of it. So, but anyway, this I kind of was disappointed with the song because I thought, it could have been a better song. It's a bit throwaway, a bit flip for such a big topic, which is the death of sex, the slow death of sex. A kind of resurgence of Puritanism. And the very first song I released on record was called Puritans on 4AD in 1982, The Happy Family. Take these Puritans away was my statement. And there's a lot of Puritanism in my family and in Scottish culture in general, a lot of Calvinism. And I was sort of saying I'm having none of this. But also being post-Calvinist, means that you are in a constant dialectic with Puritanism. The American state itself is founded on a Puritan splinter movement from the religious wars, the religious conflicts in England in the 16th century. So it's very relevant to me, my family, but also to America and to the Anglo-Saxon world in general, where this Puritanism is rampant just now. All this is kind of bubbling under the surface of this rather silly song, set to a video of Shakers dancing, looking as if they're having a really good time, actually, and as if they'd been choreographed for a theatrical production. Shakers, either they were brilliant, just inherently brilliant artists and performance artists of a kind, or they were being choreographed for those films. I don't really know what is the point of going back to that folktronic style. Perhaps it's a bit too retro, but it does seem to be something I'm doing a lot on this record, going back to older styles. Happened with September, which sounds a bit like my sort of Pet Shop Boysy phase, and Voyager as well, a little bit. And it happened with Stop the Body, which is kind of like closer to you, as if it were on Voyager or whatever. Anyway, yes, so that the record becomes a bit like an encyclopedia of former styles. Tottenham, I think it's probably the weakest track on the record. I don't know, I'm not really very happy with it just now. Midnight Sun was the next one, and this was, I was watching an old Thames television documentary about some old ladies on the Old Kent Road in a pub, and they started singing this song, We Are the Marigold Girls.
We know our manners, spend all our tanners. We are respected wherever we go. When we're rolling down the Old Kent Road, all the windows open wide. All the girls begin to cry, I to the I. We are the Marigold Girls.
And it had something about the Old Kent Road, and I started Googling these lyrics saying, what is that song? And it turned out that this was a song called Watcher, so the most charming version I could find of that on YouTube was Shirley Temple singing it in a film from 1939. My take on it is about how the dead can still talk to you. I take it for granted, really, but so many of the voices I'm listening to when I'm on my own anyway, and confronted with the internet are archival voices, they're hauntological, they are dead voices. I kind of like these musical songs where, keep your sunny side up. Even as the Second World War was approaching, there were these very cheerful musical numbers coming out of Hollywood with little girls dancing and singing these little songs about donkeys and things. And so I kind of, in my Momus way, I like to push that into a kind of paradox where things flip over, where keep your sunny side up, keep walking even although you've gone off the cliff, becomes a kind of, it starts meaning the opposite, it starts telling you how awful things really are. It's kind of about also the dead speaking to you in terms of your father. My father pops up a lot in my dreams, and I'm often having to explain to him in these dreams that he's dead. He doesn't want to accept that, quite understandably. He's always there trying to dominate everything, and I'm the one who has to go and tell him, listen, I actually said to him, this is necromancy. I said that in the dream, and when I woke up I thought, what does that mean, necromancy? And I had to look it up, and it means, communicating with the dead. So I seem to know more words when I'm asleep than when I'm awake. So the song starts with, my father still talks to me, even though he's dead, you see. And then honk the fuck out of history. As David Bowie, as doing any successful artist is going to honk the fuck out of history long after they're gone. So the contradictory idea is pushed into, sunshine in the nighttime, which is a kind of spooky thing. I mean, when you've experienced it in the Arctic Circle, as I did in the early 90s, it is really spooky. At 3 a.m, the sun is still shining. Doesn't feel natural, doesn't feel right. It feels like, if the weather has gone wrong or something like that. Just our idea of day and night time is sacrosanct. And then you get this line about how bad can death really be. If you can still speak when you're dead, if the sun does still shine in the night somehow, how bad can that be? And dead people can still sound as cheerful as they do sing in those old music hall songs. So you just have to put death out of your mind and get things done. And that's really what you're doing when you're working in culture. And there's nothing more exciting really than working in culture, but you do feel there's almost a Faustian pact in it, which is that you get to live after your death on condition that you're dead while you're alive. Not quite the Proustian thing of being in a cork-lined room, but when you're working on music, you're deep in headphones and nothing else matters. 3 weeks seems like a short time to do an album of 16 tracks, but the first Momus album was done in a couple of days. Just like the first Beatles album was done in one day, I think. There were no overdubs, you just played your live songs in the studio and they were recorded, and that was it. So 3 weeks is quite a long time actually in terms of how one used to do these things. So the next song was January, and this returns to Benjamin Britten, who is casting a long shadow across this Smudger record, very unexpectedly. I'm not quite sure why, except that I had a kind of idea of art leader, that I always have wanted to do a kind of very austere piano record in which I did Germanic style art songs, leader, chamber pop take on leader. So it's pretty much a German record, being here. So anyway, there's a little film of Benjamin Britten and Peter Pears singing Schubert. Pears singing Schubert, being accompanied by Britten. Die Winterreise, my dad had a copy of the record in the house when I was growing up, so I was aware of it in the background, and then later I got my own CD of it, and I was listening to it actually on the morning of the 9th of September 2001. As the planes came in, I had a CD of Schubert on my player, I was playing it. It was with a Japanese friend, and I could hear the sound of the explosion of the first plane hitting the first tower, the North Tower of the World Trade Center, over the music. So it kind of, history was being imposed as a layer of sound across this melancholy and very German idea of wandering in nature in a snowy landscape and feeling like a solitary romantic outsider kind of character. So Gute Nacht, the first song in Die Winterreise cycle, it's based on a poem by Wilhelm Müller, which he wrote in, I think, 1824, and it was set to music by Schubert in 1827. And Wilhelm Müller was born in Dessau, the son of a tailor, went to university here in Berlin, did philology and history, and then he was in wars against Napoleon. And then he went very German. He went to visit Italy and came back and wrote a book on Rome and the Romans. Then fashionable topics were the struggle of the Greeks against the Turks, so it's sort of a Byronic thing, and wandering in nature and unrequited love. Die Winterreise is both those two, really. He's a character wandering in nature who's kind of unrequitedly in love with someone. And he died of a heart attack aged only 32, Muller. So I was listening to this and I thought I'll make a kind of an updated version of this song. So I retranslated the lyric and tried to make it less romantic in a sense, more direct and kind of brutal. And also I cut it up and actually had a little solo of Peter Pears singing some lines from it, which are a cut-up version, which says, "Fremd bin ich eingezogen, I arrived as a stranger, der Mutter sehe ich der Haus," which according to Google means, is the chopped version, "I moved in as a stranger, I'll undress my mother." It's kind of Pet Shop Boysy with the sort of the electronic bass and stuff. Things which I've been avoiding a little bit ever since Miss McClymont won the record I did with David McClymont about 10 years ago. Which was a bit more electronic and sequenced sounding. I've been trying to use these organic instruments, accordions and chord organs and things like that, reed organs. But this one I think hit the spot in terms of listeners really seeming to like it. I think the people who like my 80s and 90s work tend to like this kind of thing. So at the moment I'm just sort of chopping and reordering the record at the moment, and at the moment it's the first cut. It opens the record. Who knows if that'll stay? But I mean, it'll stay on the record, but I don't know if it'll stay the lead track. But it seems to work, and it is very. It's got the kind of leader thing. It's got the Benjamin Britten thing, and it's got the wintry feeling. So the next track, The Coffee Professor, this started off again with the Benjamin Britten, Piers Britten, because I read somewhere that Dudley Moore had done a sketch at Beyond the Fringe in the early 60s. Beyond the Fringe was the really launching the 60s satirical thing. People like Tom Lehrer and Jake Thackeray and many others in the 60s were kind of making satirical songs commenting on current events. And so Dudley Moore I really didn't know this about Dudley Moore, that he'd actually been a bit of he became a chorister at the age of 6. At the age of 11 he earned a scholarship to the Guildhall School of Music, where he took up harpsichord, organ, violin and musical theory and composition. He won an organ scholarship to Magdalen College in Oxford, and that's where he hooked up with Alan Bennett and the other people, Jonathan Miller, the people in the Beyond the Fringe team, and shot to fame with them really. And he does a little Miss Muffet as Peter Pears with Benjamin Britten. Apparently Peter Pears thought this was very funny, but Benjamin Britten never spoke to Dudley Moore again, which conjures the image of, you know, them being on the blower every day doing a sort of Pete and Dud routine, and then suddenly that stopping, or turning into Derek and Clive with a lot of swearing. On the same video, right after the Britten Pears sketch, there's a Brecht sketch where he does this amazingly on point, amazingly accurate parody of it's a kind of combination of the Alabama song, the Pirate Jenny's ballad, and Surabaya Johnny. And I was amazed that he was able to play the piano so well and get all the cadences of Brecht, all the sort of the nuances and the way the Oh, don't ask why.
Eine Vögel geliebt von des Glück Gericht und der Krieg ist im Training gewartet. Oh. Und fragt mich, warum wir spielen gesungen und der Krieg ist im Training erwartet. Und der Krieg ist im Himmel gewartet.
I sort of made The Coffee Professor on a musical basis, which was, you know, a parody of a parody, or pastiche of a parody, you know. So it's like, the more degrees you get away from the original, somehow the more pure the essence of the original can be. So in my song, it's Coffee Professor. And this was a little bit inspired by a guy in a Paris cafe called Substance, which is just a ridiculous kind of laboratory-esque cafe where there is a barista with almost a theatrical stage, a bit like a sushi chef counter, where he ranges around talking to the customers who are all sitting around the bar facing him. He's doing this theatrical performance of preparing the coffee, talking about the beans, talking about torrefaction, all these very highly technical processes, a science really of coffee, which has become a kind of absurd theatrical moment in our lives if we're into third wave coffee. I made my Alabama song, which of course David Bowie covered in 1978, and so he was doing this Brecht song, you know, Alabama song, Show Us the Way to the Next Whiskey Bar. So my song becomes Show Us the Way to the Next Coffee Bar, essentially. And the tale of a man whose elaborate knowledge of torrefaction and terroir masks a basic addiction to the buzz of coffee. So he's got this kind of, you know, the buzz is really, he's really an addict, but he's sort of post-rationalizing it with sort of a huge knowledge about the different types of coffee you can have. And but also this professor who's very hyper and speaking very fast. It was very difficult to sing because the lyrics were so fast. He's sort of mapping coffee consumption to capitalism, because capitalism was largely brewed up, as it were, in coffee houses in the 18th century in London, or even before that. People got very hyped up on the coffee, so there's a kind of hysterical, hyper kind of over-excitation about a lot of capitalism. An addict who's also a leftist who thinks that maybe coffee will bring down capitalism. And the video uses scenes from Maurizio Kagel's 1970 film. Maurizio Kagel, very interesting composer who had theatrical mise-en-scène for his avant-garde performance pieces. I was introduced to Kagel by Rob Dickinson, who in a way has played the role to this album that Hermione Farthingale, David Bowie's ex-girlfriend, played on the Athene album, which is someone who's just bombarding me with messages while I'm recording and influencing my process by introducing me to things or ideas that I hadn't really thought about. So Rob Dickinson, he was in magazine for quite a brief time, but long enough to write Motorcade, write the music anyway for Motorcade. So he just got on Facebook or something, he got in touch. And we were talking also about The Passage, because he was in The Passage. He was in the Manchester Musicians Collective kind of scene, I guess, and avant-garde music in Manchester in the late 70s. So he was telling me he listened to Tottenham, and he said, wow, this sounds a bit like something Maurizio Kagel would have done. I'd never heard of him, and I went off and investigated. So I found this amazing 1970 film, which was for the bicentennial of Beethoven's birth. Kagel, he thought Beethoven was over-revered, so he made a kind of fake television discussion about Beethoven, and then some kind of almost Beckett-like performances of Beethoven with over-the-top theatrical performers who are made up to look very, very old, banging away on pianos where the lid is still down, and a lot of sculptural stuff with people with long ropes and tubes, attached to pianos. Just amazing visual material. Great music as well, really interesting composer. So this Ludwig van film provided it provided my accompanist, a sort of Beckett-like accompanist in the Coffee song, the Professor song, and also later in the reworking of the Eisler song, which was actually the next song I wrote. I thought, because back in May 2019, I bought at my favourite flea market down here, the Neukölln Flohmarkt, a record on the Litera label, which is the East German literary record label, by Eckhard Schall.
Von der Freundlichkeit der Welt. Auf die Erde
unbekannt, als ein Mann euch eins nahm an der Hand. Ja, die Welt, die ist euch gar nicht schuld, keiner hält euch, wenn ihr gehen wollt. Vielen Kindern war es vielleicht gleich, viele aber weinten über euch. Von der Erde voller kalten Wind, die Alte deckt mich Schock und Grind, fast ein jeder hat die Welt geliebt, wenn man ihm zwei Hände Erde gibt.
Phew. Poem by Brecht. Brecht wrote it just really kind of after his First World War experience. He was a medical orderly in the First World War, and he saw a lot of death and destruction and had to get inured really to the horror of what he saw. So he wrote this ironically titled poem called Von der Freundlichkeit der Welt, on the friendliness of the world. But actually it sort of expresses the opposite, expresses a kind of isolation and loneliness, which is actually very similar. It's almost like an answer to the poem of Müller that starts the Winterreise cycle, because it's about someone in a wintry landscape, a world of cold inhospitability, who's born. The only person who really gives a damn about him is his mother, who wraps him in nappies. And then he's finally, in the last verse, he's flung into the grave. And yet he has loved life like nearly everybody who's thrown into a hole with a couple of clods of earth thrown after them has loved this life. That's really the conclusion of the poem. It's almost a medieval, Brecht being influenced by François Villon again, this medieval sense of life's transience. Also the Beckett quote about they give birth astride the grave. I made this sort of new arrangement of the Eisler arrangement, which is so beautifully sparse and simple, appropriately enough for this song with winter winds whistling through it. My version has a much more minimalist kind of pulse of crotchets, and then in the video I've got this animation of scarves wrapping themselves around my head in between the lines, which seems appropriate since it's about being wrapped in nappies in the first verse and then swaddling clothes in the last verse. It's very short, it's 90 seconds or something. It actually ends the album. It's the final track in the sequence that I have just now of the album. And yeah, I like it. I really enjoyed arranging it because of I think it really, that modernist quality that Eisler brings to the arrangement, which is very different from what Weill did with the Brecht songs. Weill was much more interested in pop music and melodies and hooks. Beautiful arrangements, but I really admire also Eisler's sparseness. The one time I met Michael Nyman, I asked him which of Brecht's collaborators do you think was the best, and he said Hans Eisler. So that ends the record, but the final recording so far, because there's always one more thing. So, we're at 55 minutes just now, so the CD can hold more than that, but I think I tend to run over length on Mum's records, and it's quite good. I think artistically it's good not to get too long, although this one's already all over the place stylistically, so each new element kind of adds a different texture. The sensuality was lacking before. There was a lot of lugubriousness and then a lot of kind of comedy music hall silliness as well, play acting and having fun. So each new song kind of tilts the axis a little bit and gives it a different emphasis in an interesting way. So there may well be one more thing. But the final song I made, working all night, it was Stop the Body. And that started with my favourite fashion vlogger, who's called Clara Victoria, who runs Relique in Paris, a second-hand clothes shop where they have these beautiful 70s, mostly 70s clothes, 60s and 70s. She uses in her vlog sort of opening music, which is a bit trip-hoppy, and it's got a kind of very fatigued texture of twinkling vibes or something. So I used some chords and chopped them up, sampled them, and put them in a new order. And it started sounding like Closer to You or some of the tracks on Voyager, but it also reminded me of, as I was working on it, I thought that line from Sister Sledge's Thinking of You, now I'm living in ecstasy, now I'm living in ecstasy. So I thought of that just suddenly came in as a suggestion for a theme. Someone's living in ecstasy despite the fact, and the body is a source of ecstasy, but you're living in a time when the body is, under attack by the virus, obviously, but also this climate of Puritanism, which is a turn against the body and against the sensual pleasure and the ecstasy of the body. So in a way, it's returning to the 60s idea, which people like Norman O. Brown or R. Masood Khan, these radical psychoanalysts of the time, were talking about, which is, is there liberation through sensuality and sexuality? Something that's always been the kind of the dynamite, the orgasmic dynamite in Mama's songs is this idea of liberation through sex, which is very unfashionable. It's a very Grove Press, Barney Rossett kind of 60s view, as if the most radical person could be Henry Miller or something like that. And now we don't think that way because of feminism and lots of other things which have, eclipsed that vision. But I still like to think there's some mileage in that, mileage of liberation in that. And so Sister Sledge was actually an offshoot of Chic, and it had, the song was written, Thinking of You was written by Nile Rodgers and Bernie Edwards playing bass, fantastic bass on that track. And Joni Sledge, the singer, died in 2018, very young. I mean, she was 60 or something. But this theme of ecstatic release. But as usual in moments, I push it until it flips. I push that idea until it flips over and it starts becoming an ironic and doomed kind of message in a time of, when I can't even go into a cafe because my body has not been pricked enough with vaccinations. Not that I'm anti-vax at all, absolutely on the side of the vaccinations, but it is, scientifically speaking, it's a diminishing returns because each new round of vaccination is going to give us immunity for a shorter and shorter period. So it's not really got much of a future. And it feels like, you're okay, you kind of passed the hurdle of, the necessary vaccination for last year, and then suddenly the goalposts are moved and, you have to have new vaccinations. And where can it end? I mean, it probably will not continue beyond the third. I don't think we're going to be having to have fourth. I will go out and get my booster shot now so that I can just go and drink coffee in bloody cafes. But anyway, borders and bodies, freedom in our period is retreating and retreating all the time. That I can't go to Japan like I used to. I can't, for a period when I had COVID in 2020, I couldn't even leave my flat. Can't currently go to cafes. And also the Schengen idea of this free flow with no borders within Europe is dead as well, as I discovered last year travelling around Europe. There are now French customs officers jumping on and searching your suitcases on trains between Spain, Italy and France. So it's a huge reduction, a shrinkage of liberty in terms of the liberty to move around. And even within your own city, it's difficult. I can't move around freely without medical hurdles which are to do with what I've done to my body. So I find that very interesting, very topical. And of course this line, they can't stop the body, it's sort of a false optimism, because the song really starts to say, well, yes, they can stop the body. If you can't even get into a cafe with your body currently without a booster shot, of course they can stop the body. They can stop the body with a bullet, all sorts of other ways. Death stops the body. It doesn't necessarily stop the mind, though, as we know, the hauntology of culture. But if you have, the lyrics start to move into biological warfare, biometric policing, all these things which are to do with the body becoming more controllable. Of course, this was another 60s theme explored by people like William Burroughs, control, how we are controlled as social subjects by the machinery of normality. A normality which at the same time the radical psychoanalysts of the anti-psychiatry school were saying was a kind of sickness. So this horrible dystopia starts to emerge of, okay, you're being controlled ever more tightly by people who are incorrect about life, who are kind of mentally sick themselves. That was the ultimate dystopia, really. And that's what this song is about, really, that at a border or in a war or in a hospital, of course your body belongs to other people. I mean, when I had my eye problem, it was really frightening to me that I was having to be woken up every 2 hours during the night to have eye drops, to put eye drops in. And when I was trusted to do this myself, and apparently was failing to do it every 2 hours. My eye surgeon came in and gave me a very strict lecture about how I was a naughty boy to misbehave, and all the rest of it. And I'd never been controlled, even at boarding school when I was a kid. Never been controlled to quite that degree of having to wake up in the middle of the night, and be lectured if I didn't do that. So hospitals, airports, there are all sorts of places where it's become increasingly severe and increasingly unpleasant and increasingly evident that you're not in control. You don't really have this habeas corpus anymore, this idea that you had, which is a very central idea in law post-Middle Ages, really, is that you were the owner of your own body. And it's a very dubious idea which is constantly eroded, really, by authoritarian government. So, this song sounds a bit like my earlier work, which was very much, about the body and about sensuality and about refusing Puritanism and about being permissive, inverted commas, in the way they used to be back in the 60s. So that's the Smudger album, and I wonder what it's smudged. Smudging is, the idea of smudging is making things dirty and making things unclear, but also, in my experience of drawing, for instance, I would smudge things to do shading. If you wanted to make a cloud, you would do a bit of pencil on the cloud and then you'd smudge it so that it had a much smoother texture. So it can also be smoothing things over. So I'm not sure at the end of the process of recording this Smudger album what smudging means, but it possibly means making things more lucid and clear by, at the same time, making them more blurred and vague.
Open University.